Redux can seem tricky, but it doesn't have to be. It's a great technology that can help you build better React apps. In this video, we will learn how to use Redux Toolkit to set up Redux in less code. We will learn about the different parts of Redux, and we will look at how to do API calls in Redux using the Fetch API. I will show you how to get the starter code if you want to follow along. You can grab the finished code from GitHub at any time if you need to compare your code to mine. Let's get started. Okay, so if you want to follow along with the tutorial, I've provided some starter files that are on the GitHub repo for this project. So all the links are available in the description. What we want to do is clone this repository. So just grab the clone URL, open up a terminal, and then we'll just do git clone and paste in the URL. Once it's been cloned, we'll do cd react-redux-todo-app/starter. This will open up the starter folder in the terminal. And then we'll do npm install. Once it's installed, we'll do npm start, and this should open up a browser and start the application for us. Okay, so we'll just walk through the starter code and get familiar with the different components. So we have app.js, which is the main component in the app. We're using Bootstrap for some simple styling. We have our header. We have an AddTodo form, which consists of this input and this button. We have the to-do list, which holds the list, and then we have the total items, which shows the total number of complete items. All of this data is hard-coded with some dummy data at the moment. So if we take a look at to-do list, we've got an array of to-dos with some hard-coded values. We're then using the map function to display each of the to-dos in our array as a to-do item component. So we pass some properties to to-do item, and those are the ID, the title, and the completed value. If we look at to-do item, this is just displaying an item with the input, the title, and a button. So all of these components are in the components folder. If we have a look at the AddTodo form, this is the form at the top. We have a form here, which has the name, our input, and the button. We're using a state value to store what the user types. And we have an onSubmit function. This gets called when the form is submitted. And the last component to look at is the total complete items. And this just has a hard-coded value of 5 for the minute. So it doesn't correctly reflect the UI, but that's okay since we're going to change it later whenever we pull our data from Redux. Redux is made up of actions, reducers, state, and the store. Each thing does one specific task, so let's walk through an example to see how they all work together. Let's say we have a React component that lets us deposit some money by the click of a button. When we click a button, we usually call a function. This is where we dispatch our actions. So dispatch is a function given to us by Redux that lets us trigger an action. So our component has an event handler function that gets called, which calls a dispatch function. The dispatch function then dispatches an action. The action contains a type and a payload. The type is typically just a string with the name of the action. In this case, it's called deposit since that's what's happening. The payload contains the data that we need to know about. In this case, we can't deposit any money without knowing the amount. So in this case, the payload is 10. The store then receives the action and is in charge of holding the state. You can think of it like a database in a sense, which holds all our data in one place. The store is also in charge of updating the state based on the action and the current state. So it does this by using reducers, as you can see here. So the current state gets passed in and our action also gets passed in. A reducer sounds fancy, but it's just a function that takes the current state from the store and the action. It combines things together and returns the new state. So if you think of it like a conveyor belt, it takes the old state, it takes the action, it does some work in here, and it spits out the new state. The store then saves this new state, which is returned from the reducer. In this case, we get back 10, and passes the new state to the components, which causes them to re-render, displaying the new data. Why do we need all this stuff? Well, imagine if we had an app with hundreds or even thousands of components. It would become unwieldy to pass the state around and remember what component is changing the state and how it's changing the state and so on. So by breaking things up like this, we give different responsibilities to different things, and we keep all our state in one place. This makes it easier for us to understand the flow of data in our app and easier to test. For example, we can test reducers in isolation since they're just pure functions. We can test that our actions dispatch correctly and that our store correctly saves the state. Okay, so we're going to use Redux Toolkit to set up all the things we need to make Redux work. So if we go into our code, go into the source folder, we're going to create a folder called Redux. And in here, we're going to create a new file and it's going to be called store.js. So we'll open this one up. First thing we want to do is import configure store from @redux.js/ Toolkit. The configure store function does all the hard work for us. It creates a store which holds our state, it combines our reducers, and has some nice built-in middleware that we'll use later. The configure store function gives us back a store, which you can export like so. Export default configure store. This allows us to link the store to our app, which we'll do in a second. We need to pass our reducers to the configure store function, which we can do by passing an object. So in our configure store function, we'll open some braces. We'll take a new line, and then we'll say reducer, and this is going to be an object. This object will hold all our reducers. We haven't created any yet, but we could have as many reducers as we want in here. What we're doing here is creating this store. As you can see in the diagram to the left here, we have the store, and the store holds many reducers. When we create reducers, we'll come back and add them here. So now we just need to connect the store to our app. So if we save this, and we will jump into index.js, and the first thing we'll do is import our store. So import store from open quotes /redux/store, like so. And then we'll import a provider. So the import, open our braces, type provider from React Redux. And down in our JSX, we'll take a new line around line 9, and we'll type provider, and then we'll close this. And then we will say store is going to be equal to our store that we created in store.js and that we have imported at the top here. And now all we have to do is take a few lines inside of our provider, and we will cut our app and paste it inside the provider, just like so. So now our app is wrapped within the provider, which means it's got access to the store, and we just passed the store that we created to the provider. So now our app is linked up to our store, and our components have access to the state that lives in the store. Okay, so next we'll create our slice. A slice gives us a way to store a piece or a slice of data, and gives us all the things we need to change and retrieve that data. You can think of it like a grouping of data, similar to how database tables work. So the first thing we'll do is we'll jump into our code. In the Redux folder, we'll create a new file, and we'll call it todo slice.js. The first thing we'll do here is import the create slice function. So the import, open our braces, create slice from @Redux.js toolkit. And we just have to call this function. So we'll say const todo slice is going to be equal to create slice. So the create slice function will give us back some stuff and assign it to the todo slice variable. This is where we get our actions and our reducers from, which we can export so that all our components can use them. We need to pass some properties to this function so it gives us back the right things. We'll do this with an object. So in our create slice function, we'll open up some braces and take a new line. The first thing we need to add is the name. So since we're in the todo slice, we'll call this one todos. Next, we'll add the initial state. This is going to be an array of objects, each one representing a to-do. So this can be blank initially or empty, but we're going to add some dummy data for now, just so we can see what's going on. Within the array, we'll add braces, and we're going to give each one an ID. So say ID1, we're going to give it a title. This will be to-do 1, and then we need to know if it's been completed, which is going to be a boolean, and first one will say false. So we'll copy this a few times and change some of these values. We'll say ID2 and to-do 2, and the same for the last one, ID3 and to-do 3. And we'll just change completed to true, just so it's a bit different. Next, we need to add our reducers. So the reducer responds to the action. It takes the current state and creates new state based on the action payload. So the first reducer that we'll need is the AddTodo reducer. This is just a plain function that takes the state, the action, as its parameters. Redux passes in the current state and the action behind the scenes. The state is the current state of this slice. In this case, it's going to be our array of to-do items. And the action contains the type and the payload, and it comes from our component. So anytime we call AddTodo action from our components, this is the reducer that will handle that action. Since this is the AddTodo action, this is where we want to add logic to update the state with the new to-do. Since we're adding a new to-do, the first thing we want to do is create an object that represents the new to-do. So the const new to-do is equal to an object. So we'll generate an ID based on the current date, just to make sure that it's unique. We'll take the title from the payload, which comes from the action. So the action.payload.title, and we'll just default completed to be false. So this new object is going to have the same properties as the other to-dos in our array. Now all we have to do is push this to the state object. So Redux has given us the state object as a parameter. So we can say state.push to do, or new to do rather. This will add our new to do to the end of the array. At this point, Redux will take this new state and update the store. This then goes and updates our components that rely on this piece of state. This is our first reducer, but we'll add more reducers as we go through the tutorial. When we add a reducer object like this, the createSlice function creates actions based on the reducer names. So now all we need to do is get our actions and export them so that our components can dispatch these actions themselves. So to do this, at the bottom of the file, I'm going to take a new line and say export const, open some braces, and then in here we're going to say add to do equals to do slice dot actions. So after we've defined the reducers in our createSlice function, the createSlice function will return a bunch of actions and assign it to the variable that we've chosen up here. So all we're doing here is getting the actions out of the actions object. The last thing we need to do is do the same for our reducer. So the export default to do slice dot reducer. We do this because we need to add it to the store. We'll do that now. If we jump back into store.js, where we configured our store earlier in the tutorial, remember we added an empty reducer object here. So this is where we want to add our own reducers. The first thing we'll do is import the to-do reducer from to-do slice, like so. And down in the reducer property that we pass to the configure store, we just want to give this one a name, which we'll call to-dos, and say this is the to-do reducer, like so. Remember, the store holds all our reducers and manages them for us. So for example, we could have another reducer called user reducer in here, and the store will handle combining these reducers for us. Okay, so that's our to-do slice setup and our store configured. So in 2 files, we've managed to set up a whole Redux application. So we'll just do a quick recap on this. In store.js, we've configured our store. We've imported our reducer from our slice and just added this reducer to the store. We've created our to-do slice. This slice is in charge of controlling and updating the to-do state. We've just specified some default state. We've specified our first reducer, which handles the add to do action. And we've created our first action, which is add to do. Okay, so we've created the reducer and the action to add a to do. This doesn't do anything yet because we haven't dispatched the action. What we want to happen is when the user types a value in our application and click submit, we want to dispatch the add to do action. So in add to do form.js, the first thing we'll do is import the use dispatch hook. This lets us dispatch actions. And we import this from React Redux. And down in our add to do form function, what we want to do is say const dispatch. It's going to be equal to use dispatch. Since we want to dispatch the add to do action, we have to import that as well. So we'll do import, open our braces, type add to do from /redux/to-do slice, like so. Now in our function that gets called when the form is submitted, we'll add a call to dispatch the add to do action. So we'll type dispatch, open our braces to call the function, and then we'll pass in the add to do action. And we'll open our braces again. For each to do, we need to know the title. So we'll add a new object and pass in the title. This object gets mapped to the action payload. So in this object, we'll type title is going to be equal to the value that the user has typed into the form, like so, and then we'll save. So now if we try this, we type new to do 2 and click submit. Nothing happens in our UI because we haven't updated the to-do list to pull the data from Redux, which we'll do in a second. But if we open up the Redux DevTools and if we click on the action tab, you can see our add to do action has been dispatched and the payload has a title and the value that the user has typed in. If we click on the State tab and expand the to-dos list, you can see our new to-do has been added to the end of the list. So every time we add one of these and click on Submit, you can see the action gets dispatched and the state updates with the new item. Okay, so we'll do a quick recap to make sure we understand what all the different parts of Redux are doing and how they work together to update the state. So in our AddTodo form, we import the action that we want to dispatch. We can import as many actions as we like depending on the different things that are happening. We dispatch this action and pass in a payload. In this case, we pass in the title to the AddTodo action. In our to-do slice, we have an AddTodo reducer, which receives this action and the current state of the slice. We then create the new to-do based on the action payload title and add some other properties that we need before we add it to the array, which we do by saying state.push. At this point, Redux takes the new state and saves it to the store. Any components that rely on this state get updated with the new state. We'll see how components can retrieve state and be notified of state updates from Redux in the next section. Now that we've looked at dispatching actions and updating state, we'll look at how to retrieve data from Redux. In our to-do list component, we want to take the to-dos from Redux as opposed to taking them from this dummy list. To do this, we'll use what's called the useSelector hook. So we'll start by importing this. At the top, we'll do import open braces useSelector from React Redux. Now in our function, we can call this hook by saying const todos is going to be equal to useSelector. Open and close braces. This accepts a function and returns us the data based on that function. So we'll pass in our function. In this case, it'll be an arrow function. This accepts the state, which is passed in by Redux. And all we want to do here is say return us state.todos. Now this is going to go to the store, pick out all the to-dos from state, and assign it to the to-dos variable. Since we've done the hard work already to display the list in our JSX, we just need to replace the dummy list with whatever we receive from Redux. So instead of displaying this, we can comment it out. And now these to-dos will be displayed in our list. So if we save this and see if it works, you can see in our app over here that we have the 3 to-do items that are currently in state. So if we jump into our to-do slice, you can see we have the 3 items here. And if we add a 4th one, refresh the browser, you can see it's appeared. So we'll get rid of this again and we'll jump back into our to-do list. We'll delete this commented code because we don't need it anymore. It's always a good idea to clean up our code as we go. So the state value that gets passed into our function here is the entire state tree that is stored in Redux. So if you have multiple slices of state, this will return the whole thing. This is why we have to specify the to-dos. So this lets us do some pretty cool things. For example, if we wanted to get a specific to-do or filter the list, we would do it here in this function. Next, we'll look at how to mark a to-do as complete. This is interesting since it involves updating existing state, whereas up to now, we've just been adding to state. So in TODOSlice.js, we'll add a new reducer called toggle complete. Open up TODOSlice.js in the reducers object. We'll add a new reducer, toggle complete. Remember, each reducer accepts the current state and the action, which gets passed in by Redux. When our component dispatches the toggle complete action, this is the reducer that will handle that action. Now we have our reducer. We just need to implement the logic to update the state. Remember, each to-do in the list has an ID. Our component will pass this ID as part of the action payload, and we will use this ID to determine which to-do in the array needs to be updated. So in our reducer, we'll use the ID to find the index of the to-do. So say const index is equal to state.findIndex. And we'll pass in our function, which accepts the current to-do that the findIndex function is currently on. So we'll say to-do.id equals the action.payload.id. And then we'll save this. So all this is doing is finding the index of the to-do in the array based on the ID. So if the ID is 1, the index will be 0. If the ID is 2, the index will be 1, and so on. Now we know the index, we can update the completed property for the given to-do. So we'll say state, open our braces, use the index to get the to-do at that position. We'll say dot completed. So we're going to update the completed property of the given to-do. It's going to be equal to action.payload.completed. So whatever value our component passes as part of the payload, we're going to set that to the new completed value. At this point, Redux updates the state. Our selector will detect the change and re-render any components, which we'll see in a minute. With our reducer in place, we need to trigger the action that calls the reducer. First, we'll export it down here. So we'll take a new line and then we'll say toggle complete. Remember, the create slice function automatically creates actions based on our reducer names. Since we have a toggle complete reducer, that means we have a toggle complete action. Okay, so now when our checkbox is clicked, we want to trigger the toggle complete action. To do this, we'll jump into todo item.js. We'll import the dispatch hook. Import use dispatch from React Redux. And we'll assign this to a variable. So say const dispatch is going to equal to use dispatch. This will let us dispatch actions. Next, we want to import the action we want to dispatch. So we'll say import toggle complete from /redux/todo slice and save. Now in our component, we will create a function called handle complete click. This is just going to be an arrow function that dispatches our action. We'll call the dispatch function and pass in the action we want to dispatch. In this case, it's toggle complete. Remember, our reducer needs to know the ID of the to-do item we're changing and what the new completed value is. So we'll pass this in as our payload object. So in the toggle complete function, we'll add a new object. We'll pass in the ID and pass in the completed value, which will be the opposite of what the current completed value is. So if the current value is true, then the new value will be false and vice versa. Now we just need to add this to our input. So if we scroll down to the input tag, we'll take a new line. We'll say on change. It's going to be equal to handle complete click. So now if we click on a to-do, you can see the to-do gets updated. So if we have a look at our dev tools, you can see anytime we click on the input, it dispatches the toggle complete action. And the payload, you can see the ID is 1 and the completed is whatever the completed value is. And if we look at our state, we can see that our state also updates with the new values as well. So this shows that everything's working. Okay, so we'll just do a quick recap on what's happening. So we have a checkbox that calls a function. This function dispatches the toggle complete action. We pass the payload to the action, which contains the ID and the new completed value. In TODOslice.js, we have a reducer called toggle complete, which gets called and handles that action. It accepts the current state and the action that was just dispatched. It updates the current value for the completed property based on the payload action. Redux then updates the state in the store and notifies any components that rely on this state and tells them that the state's changed. Now, since our to-do list component in TODOlist.js relies on this piece of state, which it gets from the selector, the component updates based on this new state and re-renders the new data. This is why the list changes based on an action dispatch. Next, we'll look at another example of using this pattern in our app with the delete to-do. We'll go into the to-do slice and create a reducer. So we'll call this delete to-do, which will handle the delete to-do action. And this is a function which accepts the state and the delete to-do action, and this is going to be an arrow function. When our action gets dispatched, we'll send the ID of the to-do that was clicked, and then we'll filter this to-do out of the current list in state. To do this, we use the filter function. So we'll say state.filter, and this accepts a function. And in here we'll say return all the to-dos that do not equal the ID of the payload ID. So we'll say todo.id is not equal to action.payload.id. So the filter function will give us back all the to-dos that don't equal the ID in the payload. And then We just need to return this, since the filter function will return us a new array. Next, we'll export our action, which was created for us. Remember, since we created a delete to-do producer, the delete to-do slice creates a delete to-do action for us. So we can export the delete to-do like so. Next, we'll jump into to-do item.js and we'll import our action at the top. So beside toggle complete, we'll import delete to-do and create a function. This will be called handle delete click. And this is just going to be equal to an arrow function. So anytime this delete button is clicked, it's going to call this function. And from here, this is where we want to dispatch our action. So we'll say dispatch, open our braces, and we'll pass in the action that we want to dispatch. In this case, it's going to be delete to do. Remember, the reducer needs to know the ID of this to-do item that was clicked. So we'll pass in the ID as the payload. Next, we'll jump down into our button and we'll add on click event. And this will call our handle delete click. Now if we go into our app and if we delete some to-dos, you can see they are removed from the list. Next, we'll look at displaying the number of completed items. In total complete items.js, we'll import use selector hook. So say import use selector from React Redux, and we'll assign this to a variable. So we'll say const completed to-dos is going to be equal to use selector. We can pass a function to tell Redux what we want to return from state. We'll pass in our arrow function, which gives us the complete state tree. And in here, we can use the filter function. So we'll say state.todos.filter, and we'll pass in our function to the filter function. And what we want to say is give us back all the completed to-dos that have a value of true. Remember, the state value that gets passed to the selector here is the total state tree, which is why we need to specify state.todos in here. Now the result of our function gets passed to the completed to-dos variable up here. Since we use the filter function, this is going to be an array. So basically what we want to do in our UI is display the length of this array as a number here. We'll jump into our JSX and we'll delete this hard-coded value. And then we'll just say completed to-dos.length, like so. And now if we save this, you can see in the browser that it's shown us one complete item. If we start ticking these things, you can see it updates. So whenever this component mounts, it's going to go and get all the completed to-dos from state. This gives us an array, and then we just output the length of this array in our JSX. Anytime the state gets updated, if we add a to-do or check a to-do, the use selector is going to get notified of this change, and it causes this to rerun, which gives us back the new completed to-dos array. To-do API calls in Redux, we need what's called middleware. Instead of dispatching an action that goes straight to the reducer, we dispatch an action that calls a thunk, which does the API call. This then creates a normal action and sends it on its way to the reducer. So it sounds kind of messy, but let's run through this video. Instead of dispatching a plain action, our component dispatches an action that calls a thunk. This action gets intercepted by the middleware, which does the API call. Once the API call does its thing and we get a response back, the middleware takes the data and dispatches a plain old action, as we've seen before. So the payload here could be whatever was returned from the API. From here, things go on as we're used to. A reducer handles the action, accepting the current state on the action, and returns some new state. So this flow is the same as what we've learned so far. We're just adding an extra step in between which handles the API call. This is the logical place to do this, as we can't do our API call in our component, since it would be difficult to reuse that code, and we can't do the API call in the reducer, because the reducer is a pure function that creates the new state only. Okay, so now we're going to connect our app to an API, so we can practice working with APIs in Redux. I've included a pre-built API that we'll use for this. You can grab the link to check out the code in the description. Once you have the link, open up a terminal and paste it in. Next, we'll do cd react-redux-todo-app/API, and then we'll type npm install, which will install our dependencies for us. And then we'll do npm run server. And if all went well, you should see that the server is running on port 7000. To test this, we'll open up Postman. We'll create a new request, which will be a GET request, and we'll say localhost 7000/todos and hit send. And you can see in the response, it's given us back a list of a few to-dos. So we can also create to-dos. This will be a post request. Say localhost 7000/todos, and we'll pass in a body of JSON. And all we have to do is pass in the title, and the API will default the rest of the values for us. So say this is my new to-do, and if we send this, you can see the status is 200 OK, which means all went well. And the API has given us back the title of the to-do, the ID, and a default completed value of false. And it's just given us this in a to-do object. And then if we do a get again, you can see the to-do has been added to the bottom of the list. So it's important to note that if you stop and start the server, that any changes you made to the to-dos or any to-dos that you created will be reset. This is because this to-do list isn't saved to a database and it's saved in memory on the API. Let's start by getting the to-dos from the API. The first thing we'll do is import the create async thunk function. So up here, we'll just take a comma and type create async thunk, like so, and then we'll create our function. So we'll call it get to-dos async equals creates async thunk. So a thunk is a function that returns another function. This thunk is the new action which we dispatch from our components. This will in turn dispatch its own action when the response completes, with the data from the API call as the payload. So we need to pass some stuff to the create async thunk function. So we'll open our quotes and we'll give it a name. We'll call this to-dos get to-dos async, and then we'll do a comma. Then we'll pass in the function that uses the fetch API to get the data. So this is going to be an async function. It's going to be an arrow function, like so. And inside the function, we're going to say const response is equal to await fetch. And then we're just going to pass in our API URL. So it's going to be http://localhost 7000/todos. If the response is good, we will convert the response to JSON. So we'll say if response.ok. We want to say const todos is equal to await resp.json. This takes the response, which is going to be a array of to-dos. It converts it to JSON and assigns it to the to-dos variable. Lastly, we'll return an object that contains our to-dos. Once the function returns, it will dispatch an action. Whatever we return, in this case, an object containing a to-do array, will be the payload of the action. Whenever this returns, it'll dispatch an action and the to-dos will be in the payload. And all this is done behind the scenes. Okay, so now we have our action and our thunk. We need to implement the reducer logic, which will handle this action. So if we jump into our slice, we do this within the extra reducers object. This is where we specify additional reducers that our to-do slice can use. So the syntax is a bit different, as our thunk will dispatch a number of actions. The action we care about right now is the fulfilled action. So if we open our square braces and we add the name of our thunk get to-dos async dot fulfilled. When the thunk dispatches a fulfilled action, this means the API call in our thunk has completed and dispatched this action successfully. So these reducers work the same as the plain reducers that we've used before, and it's just a plain function which takes the state and the action. Now we'll return the to-dos that came in the payload, at which point React will update the state for us. So we'll say return action.payload.todos. Okay, so now we have our action and our thunk, and we have the reducer that's going to handle the fulfilled action that the thunk dispatches behind the scenes. We just need to export our thunk. So at the top, we'll just do export like so. Now we have to trigger the action that fetches the to-do. The best place to do this is when the to-do list component gets loaded for the first time. So if we jump into to-do list, we will import use dispatch, and we'll assign this so that we can use it. So say const dispatch equals use dispatch. So we want to get the to-dos as soon as this to-do list component loads. So we'll add the use effect hook, which lets us do this. So we'll import use effect from React, and in our component we'll say use effect. We'll pass in the function that we want to call, and just after the function we'll pass in our dependency array. This is just the list of things that will trigger this use effect function. And in here we will say dispatch and pass in the action that we want to dispatch, which we need to import from the top. So we'll do import get to-dos async from Redux /to-do slice. And we'll pass this in here like so. And we'll just update our dependency array to include dispatch, just to avoid any crazy side effects. Okay, so in our to-do list, we have a use effect hook, which is going to get called when the component loads for the first time. And in this function, we're going to dispatch the get to-dos async action, which goes off and fetches the to-dos and adds them to state. Because the state's updated, the selector gets notified and our to-dos update, causing the component to re-render. Okay, so now if we try this, you can see that we have 5 to-dos. If we look at the dev tools, you can see that our fulfilled action is being dispatched, and you can see the payload has a list of to-dos that have come back from the API. If we look at the network tab, and if we reload the page just to trigger the request, you can see it calls the to-do API, it does a get, it returns 200 OK, and the preview of the response has all the to-dos in it. Remember I mentioned our Thunks dispatch a number of actions behind the scenes. You can see here that when the request is in progress, it dispatches a pending action. This is useful for displaying a loading spinner or logging some messages and so on. Just to see this part working, if we go back into our to-do slice, down in our extra reducers, we can do some stuff in here based on the pending state. So we'll say get to-dos async.pending, and this is also just going to be a plain function that takes the state and the current action. But for now, all we'll do is console.log and say fetching data, and we'll copy this, paste it in our fulfilled one, and this message will say fetched data successfully. And we'll save this. Now if we look at our DevTools again and open our console, and we'll just refresh the page, you can see the 2 messages have appeared based on the different actions. So the first one says fetching data. Whenever the data has returned and the fulfilled action gets dispatched, it sends us a fetch data successfully message. Okay, so that's the basic approach to using Thunks to fetch data within Redux. So we'll just do a quick recap now before practicing with the other features. So in our to-do slice, we create a thunk. This gets called by our components. Our component dispatches the get to-dos async action that gets created by this thunk. This does an API call. If the response is good, then it takes the data, it converts it to JSON, assigns it to the to-dos variable, and then we return this to-dos object. At this point, the thunk will dispatch a action that says that the request is completed, and the to-dos object will be part of the payload. Since an action was dispatched, it goes down to the reducers. It finds the reducer that will handle that action. The reducer will take the state and the action, and it just returns the to-dos taken from the payload. So at this point, the state gets updated into the store, and all the components that depend on this bit of state, so in this case the to-do list, gets updated because the selector has been informed by the store that the to-do state has changed. Because this updates, then this variable gets updated, which means our JSX re-renders with the new data. And the process that triggers all this is when the component loads, we dispatch the get TODOs async action from our useEffect hook. Next, we'll look at how to add a to-do. In TODOslice.js, we're going to create a thunk. So this is going to be similar to the get TODOs async. We'll call it const add to-do async. And this is going to be equal to create async thunk. So we'll give it a name. TODOs/add to-do async. We'll create our async function. This time we pass in the payload parameter, as we need to know the title of the to-do. This payload variable contains whatever was sent to us by the component when it dispatched the action. So we'll just finish our arrow function like so. And in here we're going to use the fetch API. So say const response is equal to await fetch, open our braces, and we'll say http ://localhost 7000/todos, and we need to pass in a object with some configuration. So we're going to say the method for this request is going to be post, and we'll add some headers, and we'll say the content type is going to be application/JSON. Lastly, we need to send a body. So the body is going to contain the title of the to-do that the user entered when they filled the form. We need to stringify this, and then we'll just pass in an object, and we'll say title is going to be payload.title, like so. Now, if the response is okay, the API will give us back a to-do object with the title, the ID, and a default completed value. So if we jump over to Postman, and if we make a post request here, we're just going to pass the title in the body of our request. And if we click send, you can see the response comes back with a to-do object, which has our title, ID, and a completed value. This is what we want to get out of the response and put into state. So if we jump back to our code and TODOslice.js, we're going to say if response dot is okay, we will get the to-do from the response. So we'll say const to-do equals await response dot JSON, and then we'll just return this to-do as a new object. Okay, so now we have created our thunk, and this will create a bunch of actions for us. Whenever the requests have finished, the add to do async dot fulfilled action will get dispatched, and it will have the to do as part of the payload. So now we just need the reducer to handle this action. So if we jump down into our extra reducers, we'll take a new line, open our square braces, and we will say add to do async dot fulfilled, and this is just going to be an arrow function that takes the current state and the action that was passed into it. And all we want to do here is say state dot push action dot payload dot to do. So when the action is triggered, this reducer will handle the fulfilled action. It's going to take the to do from the payload, and it's going to push it to the current state. So then at this point, Redux will update the store and notify our components that something has changed. All we need to do now is wire up our new action to our AddTodo form. So if we jump into AddTodo form.js, instead of importing AddTodo, we're going to import AddTodo async, and we're just going to dispatch it in our onSubmit function. When the button gets clicked over here, it's going to dispatch the action with whatever the user has typed in here. If we save AddTodo form.js and jump over to our browser, and we'll add a new to-do. So say wash the car. And if we hit submit, you can see it gets added to the bottom. And if we refresh the page, it persists because it's being stored on the server. The last thing that we're going to do before I set you a challenge is to call the API anytime a to-do is marked as completed. Currently, if we complete all these to-dos and then refresh, it doesn't persist on the API, so everything gets reset. The approach that we're going to take for this is similar to what we've done before. So we'll jump into to-do slice, and we're going to create a new async thunk. So we'll say export const toggle complete async, and this is going to go to create async thunk. And again, we'll pass in our name. So we'll say to-dos / complete to-do async. And we'll pass in our async function, and we need to accept the payload, since the payload will contain whether the to-do is to be marked complete or not complete. And this will be an arrow function, like so. And then we'll say const response equals await fetch, and this time we're going to pass in a template string, and we'll add our endpoint localhost 7000 / to-dos. And because we are updating an existing to-do, we need to pass in the ID of the to-do that we're updating. So to do this, we open our curly braces with a $sign in front, and then we'll just take the ID from the payload. And we need to pass in some config to our fetch request. We're going to say the method is a patch because we are updating an existing entity on the API. And we'll pass in our header, which is going to be content type application /JSON. And for the body, we're going to pass in the completed value, which we get from the payload. So we've got a fetch request here, which is going to update the completed value for a given ID. So if the response is okay, we're going to get back a to-do in the body, similar to whenever we added a to-do up here. So all we'll do is say const to-do is equal to await response dot JSON, which will get our updated to-do object from the response, and then we'll return an object, and then we're going to say the ID is going to be the to-do .id, and the completed value is going to be to-do.completed. Whenever our thunk returns, it's going to dispatch an action, and it's going to have this object as part of the payload. So now we'll create a reducer. If we go down to extra reducers, take a new line, and we'll say toggle complete async dot fulfilled, and this is going to be a function that takes the current state and the action. And the logic is going to be similar to what we have up here in our original reducer. So what we can do is just copy this and paste it in like so. And all this does is it takes the ID from the action payload, it finds the index of the to-do that we're updating, it uses the index to update the completed value of that to-do at that specific position. And then as usual, when this function is completed, Redux will update the state and tell our components about it. And finally, we just need to jump into to-do item. And instead of toggle complete, we want to import toggle complete async and dispatch it from our handle complete click. So the handle complete click gets called whenever one of these checkboxes is ticked or unticked. So now if we save this, if we tick some of these things and refresh, you can see it's been persisted. Okay, so just to summarize the working with an API part of this, whenever you need to do an API call or something similar, create a thunk. So this comes from Redux Toolkit and does a lot of magic behind the scenes for us. Any data that you need to store in state that comes back in the response, you return as part of the payload. This then gets dispatched as part of an action, and then you just go down to your extra reducers, create a reducer to handle the action. Then in your component, import the async action and dispatch it as usual from an event handler or otherwise. Okay, so a challenge for you to try is to delete a to-do from the list. So currently, if we delete it, then it gets deleted from the UI, but if we refresh, it doesn't get persisted on the API. So the API has support to delete a to-do by its ID. What you need to do is add a async thunk that handles a delete request. So the delete request is going to look something similar to this. It's going to use the fetch API. It's going to pass in the ID, which is going to need to get somehow. And you need to pass in the method, which in this case will be delete. Create an async function, which does this API call. And then you're going to want to create a reducer in the extra reducers part that updates the state once your request is fulfilled. The logic for that will be similar to what we did for the delete to already. And then from there, you just need to dispatch your action. So you're going to have to make a change somewhere in to-do item.js. Okay, so that wraps up for this video. If you have a go at the challenge, or if you add your own features to this tutorial, let me know on Twitter or drop me an email, because it's always good to see what you come up with. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe and share this video with your friends. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.